Citizens Against Government Waste has named Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders and Speaker Nancy Pelosi as their porkers of the month for their shepherding of the $3.5 trillion social infrastructure bill through Congress. Assuming it gets through Congress, we shall see. And joining us now to talk about that is Tom Schatz, Citizens Against Government Waste. Before we get into the bill, Tom, which has been affectionately named the Build Back Better bill by the Biden administration. Critics might call it something different, the 3Bs. Let's go with the Biden's biggest blunder bill. We'll find out. Time will tell. But I want to get into some of the details and some of the wasteful spending on that bill. But let's set the stage first. Congress is juggling lots of balls right now. We've got the debt ceiling. We've got funding the government. We've got the 1 point plus infrastructure bill, and then the 3.5 social infrastructure bill. Let's talk about funding the government first. We got to get that done first, right?
Right. And the Senate has said that they are happy to fund the government. They will just not agree, Senate Republicans, they will not agree to including the extension or suspension of the debt ceiling in that legislation. It was brought to the floor. All 50 Republicans said no, and therefore it cannot pass because that legislation requires 60 votes. It passed the House, which only requires a majority. But generally, continuing resolutions just go through because it just extends funding for the government at the same level as the prior year, and it has to get done. Otherwise, there's no government funding. And in this case, the debt ceiling generally has been bipartisan, but often tied to efforts to restrict any further growth in spending. And by the way, this happened under Republican majority with a Republican president, and the Democrats objected, and Republicans had to do it themselves. So this is not unusual. In this age of social media, everything sounds like it's the end of the world. It never happened before. Everything's going to fall apart. But this is just politics as usual in Washington, maybe a little bit more acrimonious than it used to be. Right. But because all these other issues are tied to it, the infrastructure bill and the $3.5 trillion budget, that's what's causing this big fight about the debt ceiling and the continuing resolution.
Right. So it's probably going to get done. And then we move on to the $1+ trillion infrastructure bill. And then we move on to the $3.5 trillion social infrastructure bill, the budget as you term it. There's a wonderful picture in Axios this morning of Senator Barrasso of Wyoming holding up a draft of this bill at a press conference yesterday. It's about this thick, about that big, 5,000 pages. Nobody's going to read this thing, Tom. You know that well.
Well, it's not just that. The Senate hasn't had a single hearing on it. So let's understand this. This is Bernie Sanders, essentially, Bernie Sanders' budget. 90+% of what he had in his campaign literature is in this legislation. And I'll talk about some examples later. But even he didn't have a hearing because if people knew the details, there's no way that this would even come close to passing. And by people, I include a lot of these quote unquote moderate Democrats, really Democrats who won traditionally Republican districts in the suburbs around a lot of the big cities, who won by thin margins and are already in trouble for next year and would really be in trouble if people understood exactly what was in the bill and what it was going to do to really how this country is fundamentally governed. It is a socialist spending bill. There is no way to get around that. And I think that's one of the reasons why they don't want to hold hearings, but it also justifies why the Republicans are saying, hold on a minute here. We're not going to vote for this because it is socialist, but also because you're not even talking about it. And we don't even have the chance to make modifications or change anything.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's speculation that it's actually much more than $3.5 trillion. I've seen the number $5 trillion, even seen the number $7 trillion. It gets to the point where those kind of figures become almost meaningless. They're so huge. Why not refer to it as a gazillion dollars or a bazillion dollars? But and it just allows the waste to be more profligate. That's the bottom line here. Let's get into some of the waste. What strikes you?
Well, sorry, before that, Doug, the other point is that the Congressional Budget Office, which is responsible for scoring or calculating the cost of legislation, has not scored this bill, which is in part why the $3.5 trillion could be more. We know that some committees went over their reconciliation instructions. above the amount that they were allowed to spend. So there is no way to know exactly what they're doing. So it's not just failing to have the time to read the bill or hold hearings. It's also that there is no official score of the bill. And again, that has happened before, but not on anything this substantial and this excessive. So, for example,
and it's going to happen on a straight party line vote. So there's
right.
only one party support for this gargantuan.
Right. But on the procedure, it will go under what's called reconciliation, which is a majority. In the Senate, it's 50 plus the Vice President, Kamala Harris. In the House, it's 218, but they only have 3 votes to spare. So if the progressives, only 100 in this caucus, or the quote unquote moderates, maybe a dozen, one or the other says we're not going to vote for either the infrastructure bill, the $1.5 trillion, or the $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill, they both fall apart. Because the progressives, this is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Squad and a lot of others in the House these days, they've said they won't vote for the $3.5 trillion. They won't vote for the infrastructure bill without the budget bill being considered. And they're saying they want that first. Yeah. Speaker Pelosi saying no, it's the other way around. So we made Speaker Pelosi and Senator Sanders Porkers of the Month because they're so, as Speaker Pelosi said, excited and exhilarated about this $3.5 trillion bill. And we're calling it Biden's budget boondoggle. You can make 3 Bs anything you want on this. It is not Build Back Better. It's building an entirely new country, including, for example, Representative Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Markey's efforts to create a civilian climate corps. This is not the conservation corps that FDR put together when we were coming out of the Depression, and maybe the government had a role in creating jobs. She originally wanted $132 billion to create 1.5 million jobs, basically to have people come around and pick up the trash and tell you that, the climate's a big deal. But they did include $32 billion in the reconciliation bill, which will only hire about 360,000 of these people. Well, think about that. A civilian climate corps, and we'll walk around town and say, hey, pick up that garbage. And by the way, the world's getting warmer and have a nice day. And I'm getting paid $50 an hour.
Will they have any enforcement powers?
No. The Corps, it's just jobs. It's like the Job Corps or the Peace Corps, both of which you might argue has a little bit more of a history and might be a little bit more successful, although both somewhat wasteful.
At a time when there are already 10 million unfilled jobs in the country.
Right, and that's right. But it's not the government's job to give those jobs to, because again, the government doesn't create the revenue to, pay for those jobs. And it's just a waste period because it's not necessary. This is just part of the ideological, it's a very ideological bill. It's not really trying to achieve anything other than what Senator Sanders has been pushing for a long time, and representatives like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, which is to get all of these socialist ideas funded by the federal government.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the other socialist ideas that upset you?
Well, one of the worst is in healthcare. There's legislation called H.R. 3, which has been passed by the House a few times. This legislation would essentially create a set of restrictive price controls on the pharmaceutical industry. And this is after, of course, they created the COVID-19 vaccines. They saved millions of lives. It was done in record time. And it was mostly done by American companies. Yes, there were German and English companies, but mostly American companies. And we by far lead the world in research and development of new drugs. It's not even close, something like 2/3 or more are developed here. And so what they want to do is have the government set the price based on what other countries charge for their drugs. And of course, they're feeding off and living off of our research and development, which is why they're able to charge less. There are other solutions to that, but that's not for this particular discussion. What it will do is, if the government sets the price and the manufacturer does not agree, the government can charge up to a 95% tax on that particular drug, meaning that nobody's going to create new drugs. And the estimates of how many new drugs will not be created range from 30 to 40 a year to maybe 100 over the, or 200 or 300. It's a lot over the next 10 to 15 years. And that also means that no one will want to invest in pharmaceutical companies because they won't be able to get any return. And that's already been discussed extensively among venture capitalists and others. And that also means the government will be, quote unquote, doing the research and development of new drugs. Well, the National Institutes of Health budget spends only about $2 billion a year on research and development. The rest is on a lot of other important items. The pharmaceutical industry spends $102 billion annually on R&D. And of course, it costs $2.6 billion to bring a drug to market because of all the other drugs that fail on the way to getting there. So of course they need to get their money back. So if the government's controlling the prices, that's what happens in these other countries. They also have access to fewer drugs, and then which diseases don't get cured, right? ALS, Alzheimer's, cancer, MS, sickle cell, all of that is going to be in trouble because of what this legislation would do.
It's not exactly on the healthcare front, but maybe tangentially related to it. Childcare is another component of this thing, massive childcare, but it's a sort of a one-size-fits-all approach. And daycare is a very sort of individually unique thing for families. One-size approach doesn't work for childcare.
No, it doesn't. And one of the more reasonable things that's been suggested is to at least have some kind of income level or some kind of means test to determine who needs childcare. That's another problem with a lot of these proposals, that they cover essentially everybody. People making more than $150,000 a year for a lot of these programs. So there's not just new spending, there is expanded spending for existing programs. And childcare is one of those areas where it just is just too much.
Mm-hmm. We've seen it in the past, examples of profligate federal spending on research, such as shrimp on a treadmill, that sort of thing. Are there examples of that in this bill?
Well, nothing specific like that, but well, we do know that in terms of quote unquote earmark, that Speaker Pelosi got $200 million to fix up the Presidio Park because she loves walking there. So there's one example, and I'm sure there are others, but who's read the thing? It's 2,500 pages. So without any hearings, without any transparency, it's difficult to know about a very specific project like somebody's bridge named after them somewhere. Mm-hmm. But I'm sure those will come up.
Conservative media has been focusing on the divisions in the Democratic Party, but when push comes to shove, this is all about the sausage making, really. And Pelosi, for all the criticism that she endures, is a very effective leader. She rules with an iron fist, and she does oftentimes manage to corral her herd of cats. Do you expect that to happen?
Again, it's a matter of the dollars. I mentioned that earlier. How much do they want to spend? Which of these programs will remain? There was a story yesterday that Representative Ocasio-Cortez is fighting for that that climate core. And so it's trade-offs. What is, for example, Senator Sinema's bottom line or Senator Manchin's bottom line? I saw this morning it might be less than $2 trillion. Now that's a big jump from what the quote unquote progressives want, which by the way is $6 trillion. Let's set that stage, right? Senator Sanders said, I've already compromised. I wanted 6, we're at 3.5, I'm done. Mm-hmm. So for them to go under 2, I think would be very, very difficult. And that may be where they just can have a continuing resolution. They keep funding the government at this level and they get nothing. It is possible for that to happen. But that's all going to be known within the next few weeks to mid-October, because the debt ceiling issue is pretty real. And I think by October 18th, we may have a huge impact on the markets and global markets, and that's when they might wake up and say, and maybe we should just deal with that. I'm
glad you mentioned Manchin and Sinema. They wield unusual power. It's really difficult to discern what Sinema's motivation is, other than she's fiercely independent. Easier to discern what Manchin's motivations are here. He comes from a fossil fuel state, and the green energy component of this bill would basically ruin the economy of his state in terms of fossil fuels, in terms of fracking and coal production. What do you think the Sinema's motivation is?
Well, interestingly, she likes the climate change provisions, which Senator Manchin does not like. So even if they agree on a number, I'm not sure what stays and what goes. And they've had plenty of time to figure this out, of course, and everybody knew that they were not going to be on board with $3.5 trillion. They made that clear when they voted on the reconciliation itself. Senator Manchin said, I'll vote for it to get it moving, but I'm not going to approve $3.5 trillion. And they're sitting there saying, well, you got to vote for this. He said, no, I'm not. But Senator Sinema is interesting. She used to be a lot more, quote unquote, liberal or more progressive, however you define that these days. But somehow now that she is in the Senate, I think she's looking at her reelection and saying to herself, I can't go that far over in Arizona and get reelected, which is most of these members of Congress have as motivation, other than creating programs as the answer to everything, which they're doing a good job of these days.
And we know that President Biden has met at least on one or two occasions with each of those two senators. What is his negotiation strategy here? He is a creature of the Senate. I've read that he does not want to get involved in the minutiae. He knows how it works. He knows that when the clock is ticking down, solutions are often reached within his party, and because of Schumer and Pelosi are effective leaders in that regard. They, again, heard their cast. What are your expectations?
Well, again, this is pretty well known that he yelled at Senator Manchin when the budget came up in the first place and said, you're going to ruin my presidency and get on board. And added a few words I can't say on television, use this show. And so he may be saying the same thing. You know, this is my presidency, and for us all to get reelected, you need to go along. So that's the big picture that he might bring up, rather than saying, you know, you have to have this or you have to have that. So yeah, at least from that standpoint, he does have a lot of experience.
What is your forecast, if you care to venture? Do you expect passage of this $3.5 trillion bill?
I would say it might be 2.5, but they don't have a lot of time to figure it out. And I think that
what is the time constraint?
Well, the time constraint is, of course, the end of the fiscal year. They have to have the continuing resolution literally by the end of midnight of October 1st, which is pretty soon. And then the next deadline really is the debt ceiling, say mid-October. So they will have time, once they get the government funded, to work out all these other issues. Those other issues are not time sensitive. They don't need to have the infrastructure bill or the reconciliation bill approved before the fiscal year begins. So if they take it one step at a time, they can do the continuing resolution without the debt ceiling. Then they've got to put together a new reconciliation bill that includes the debt ceiling, because Republicans said they won't vote for it. So that's how I see everything going.
I see.
And we'll know, and we'll at least know part of this fairly soon.
But that also excludes the political considerations. The president is looking at dropping poll numbers right now. A lot of moderate Democrats are concerned about re-election. The midterms are coming up eventually, and that's going to play into the negotiations as well.
Well, again, that's what I mentioned earlier, that if people took the time to read it, and if some of the provisions were publicized in a lot of those swing districts where Democrats won where they hadn't won in many years, Donald Trump is not on the ballot next year. So this is all about President Biden. And when a president's approval rating is this low, the third worst in many, many years, then it has a dramatic impact on the down ballot senatorial and congressional races. Look, it may even have an impact on the governor's race in Virginia, based on, again, just a quick note, you know, on the poll of registered voters, Terry McAuliffe is ahead. On the likely voters, Glenn Youngkin is ahead, because there's more enthusiasm when you're, quote unquote, voting against something than for something. And I think the against is kind of winning out here, because people are very unhappy with the president and the Democrats right now.
Right. Tom Schatz, we always appreciate your insight and your experience. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you. Always a pleasure. Thank you.